This is video 3 on chapter 20. So again, we're transitioning a bit from the H.W. Bush administration to that of Bill Clinton. So this is another nice description from your book here, as Herring says Clinton was smart, gregarious. Gregarious means sort of a well-spoken or very talkative, charming, charismatic, and natural-born politician, although he was notoriously undisciplined in his work habits and private life. So if you sort of think about the presidents of recent decades, probably Bill Clinton fits the most of that, like he says here, natural born politician. Clinton's very slick, sort of in debates and in conversation and so forth. Say particularly so compared to maybe the more recent presidents of Barack Obama and George W. Bush. So this was an interesting election in 1992. So not only did you have Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, but you also had this billionaire businessman by the name of Ross Perot, guy from Texas. So if you remember from American politics, I think I showed you that electoral results where he actually got about Ross Perot got about 19% of the vote that year. Again, it's not bad for somebody running as what we call an independent, so neither the candidate for the Democrats nor the Republicans. Again, not bad. He didn't win any electoral votes, but still, you think about it, that's a lot of people that voted for what we call a third-party candidate. So a lot of folks say, in a lot of ways that Ross Perot probably helped Bill Clinton win that election. All right. So although George H.W. Bush had some successes, particularly with the Persian Gulf War, where again that we looked at in an earlier video that was seen as a textbook example of collective security. The group of countries went in, repelled that aggressor state of Iraq. So as far as foreign policy in particular, Bush was seen as really pretty strong president. But as an issue that befalls a lot of presidents, the economy started to tank towards the end of his first term in office, and a lot of folks saw Bill Clinton as perhaps more what maybe the country needed at that time, right? Starting in 1993, where he had more of a focus on economics, jobs, trade, all these kind of things. It was just seen as maybe more knowledgeable, or had more ideas as far as improving the unemployment rate and gaining new trade relationships, these type of things. So I would recommend, if you have a minute, just to check out this. This is kind of a funny Saturday Night Live clip of actually when Bill Clinton's still a candidate, where he used to actually be a bit more on the heavy side, and they used to kind of give him a hard time because he liked to go to McDonald's and Pizza Hut and a lot of those other kind of places. So you can check that out. So then the last thing we'll talk about on this slide is, so obviously foreign policy a lot has some main connections to the military. If we're going to use force, of course, the military is going to have to be involved there. So he was kind of known as he had during the Vietnam War, he actually went over to England. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in England. So that he did not serve in the military at that time. People called him a draft dodger, right? That he was able to dodge the United States military draft at that time for the Vietnam War. So, and also since he was, again, you can see here, a pretty younger guy when he entered office, and he had never had any kind of military experience. They had seen that from the beginning he had sort of a conflictual relationship with a lot of the military, particularly the high up guys that did not maybe respect him to the same level as maybe they did the previous president. All right, so like I said in the previous slide, Clinton was big into this kind of time period, right, about trade and globalization and these type of things. So your book calls him an unabashed enthusiast for these kind of things, right? That say free trade, right, taking away tariffs and other kind of barriers to trade, that kind of thing. He really saw as a great way to build the American economy. So one of the things that happened during his early years in the White House is something called NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement. So this is a bilateral between two countries, or actually trilateral, sorry, between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So again, so eliminated trade barriers to trade between these countries. So since that time, we don't have any kind of import tariffs on goods from Mexico and vice versa. All right. So one of the things that did is, although it really helped our economy, a lot of our particularly manufacturing jobs did go south to Mexico. Although it's interesting to note that, and I've written a lot of other things about this, say in my book, that even though some jobs did go there, overwhelmingly China Of course, you think about so much stuff in our country today, right? It says made in China, not made in Mexico. So although while this is important, it wasn't like that when NAFTA came out that it meant that all of our stuff was going to start coming from Mexico. All right, so again, that's more closer to home. Then another major one we were involved in is APEC, so the Asia Pacific Economic Community. So this is going to be kind of a lot of the major countries there in East Asia, Australia, and so forth, right? So again, also sort of a big trade organization that we're involved in. Not a free trade zone, but at least has that some of those kind of efforts. So this is an important concept that I wanted you to be aware of as well. So it's a major international organization in the world today called the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So this previous organization, GATT, existed till '94, and then you can see the WTO came in 1995. So this is supposed to be sort of the major kind of governing or organizational body for trade in the world today. But one of the things we want to look at is, what happened during this period. People looked at sort of this dynamic of, are you looking more at human rights, say labor conditions, people's wages, that kind of thing. So like, expanding trade might sound great, but what does that mean if people are earning 3 cents an hour or living or working under horrific conditions, almost slave labor kind of conditions? So trying to find a balance between that, was difficult at that time, and I guess you could say still is today. So related to the WTO, there's a concept that I wanted you to be familiar with called Most Favored Nation Status, or MFN status. Now, a lot of people get confused about that because Most Favored Nation makes it sound like that you have one nation, or you're looking at one nation more favorably than all the others. But actually what that means is sort of if everybody's supposed to have Most Favored Nation status that's in the WTO. So basically that means that, if you sign up to these agreements, countries cannot, are not supposed to normally discriminate between their trading partners. So, if you do something special for one country, for example, you're supposed to do the same for the other. So it's not like somehow giving special status, so most favored nation. All right. So then we want to look at some of the other figures at this time, right? So during his first term, these are actually during his entire presidency. These were the secretaries of states, right? So Warren Christopher during the first term, and then Madeleine Albright during the second term of Clinton's presidency. So she is actually the first woman ever to be Secretary of State. Now, of course, that's become more commonplace, of course, with Condoleezza Rice, and then more recently with Hillary Clinton. But she was the one that kind of started it off there. So remember, Secretary of State is a challenging job, right? You log a lot of miles flying around the world, meeting with people and things. So that's definitely a cabinet level job that we often see where people tend to just do one term. Spending 8 years, say if president got reelected, that you would spend 8 years as Secretary of State would be a bit overwhelming. Particularly as you can see, it's not like these people tend to be young folks, right? These are people that are getting up there in age a little bit, and that kind of schedule is obviously extraordinarily demanding. All right, so also looking at in this period, so again, the Cold War is over, so we see, well, what about sort of these, small fires, or, instead of this global superpower competition, what about issues in other parts of the world? So we see this kind of looking at, say, peacekeeping and peace enforcement. So I'll give you the definitions more explicitly on the next slide. But we also want to look at, say, collective security comes back in again. So that that was seen as a very successful operation related to collective security, right? The first Persian Gulf War, towards the kind of middle and end of George H.W. Bush's time in office. So the United Nations starts to get more involved in this as well. Right, so you can see by the early 1990s, right, there's already 17 military missions, right, of troops. So the United Nations, of course, is not its own country. Where these troops come from are given to it or sort of lended. So these peacekeeping and peace enforcement issues become a big deal in the international community. So you can see here, again, no small feat. It's 70,000 personnel involved here. So like I said, these are troops that are collected, say, from different countries. People call them the blue helmets, right? Since they do have sort of different uniforms. So they're not there, like say if Canadian troops happen to be there or something, they would be taking direction more from they could easily be taking direction from people from other countries. So we'll sort of look at some of these things like monitoring ceasefire, ensuring compliance with UN resolutions. So like I said, here's your definitions of these two. So peacekeeping, peace enforcement. So you can see they're very similar, as far as the troops involved and that kind of thing. The important differences are, you can see here that peacekeeping is preserving a peace where fighting has already been put a stop to it, has been halted. So let's say the warring parties have kind of put down their weapons, so keeping the peace, right? They say if they've tried to reach a peace accord to try to keep that going. Peace enforcement, on the other hand, is maybe a little stronger method. You could think about it that way. So more coercive or forceful action undertaken under the authorization of the UN Security Council to end those hostilities, right? Enforce a peace agreement. So perhaps you could think about they often are still fighting when a peace enforcement mission might happen. Now, so peacekeeping efforts are you could say far more common. Again, because a lot of times the United Nations is not going to want to intervene in a hot conflict. Right. So one of the other major instances that happened sort of towards the beginning of Clinton's presidency is this issue of Somalia, where we kind of think about a basket case, or what often people would refer to as a failed state there in the Horn of Africa in East Africa. So collective security in this case did not work, right? The idea that a group of states getting together to solve a situation, that sort of failed in Somalia, and nobody really wanted to get involved there. So again, this is not like they were fighting. Somalia was not fighting another country. It was more of a civil war going on there. So you see between 92 and 94. So the mission there was supposed to be more humanitarian relief. So maybe you could also think about that this was a different case study than, say, the Iraq War, where Iraq had invaded Kuwait and was trying to overtake Kuwait. So this was obviously a different situation, more of a humanitarian idea. All right. So Mogadishu is the capital of Somalia. So you might be familiar with some of this from the movie called Black Hawk Down. I think it won some Academy Awards and things. It was a really popular movie from the early 90s. So Black Hawk, of course, refers to the type of big military helicopters, the black helicopters. So this was about an incident where a helicopter had crashed there in the capital, right? And how those soldiers sort of dealt with that situation. So a lot of U.S. soldiers, where you can see, were killed in this attempt to capture this warlord, Adid, in October of '93. So things were just going bad there, right? Again, if you think about some of that stuff from the Powell Doctrine, as far as clear objectives and exit strategy, all these kind of things, that the Congress and the American people maybe were a bit more suspicious about what was going on in Somalia. So this country has had extraordinary difficulties over the past few decades, and probably one of the places in the world we can really think of the term anarchy come into play there. So another issue that also embroiled Africa during this time was in the small country of Rwanda. It's kind of the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, moving closer to South Africa area. So this is definitely an instance of genocide, and it actually happened fairly quickly over the course of a few weeks or a few months even. So you can see your book calls it the fastest, most efficient killing spree of the 20th century. This is, so you look at this numbers, right? So we have two major groups here: the Hutus, who murdered close to 1 million Tutsis during this time period, right? So actually, the Hutu is more the majority group, and the Tutsis were the minority group, who were more prevalent in the government, kind of had more influence in society and business, that type of thing. Now, what's interesting is with some of this is, again, this is sort of very localized conflict flavor. And what I mean by that is, you and me, or other people in the United States and most other countries, wouldn't even be able to tell these people apart. It's not like they really looked any different, that type of thing. But again, so sometimes you think about how these things can take on a different meaning. So President Clinton, in one of his memoirs after the fact, called this his worst foreign policy mistakes, and area, an example of where we could have got in but did not.